with clients? Do you have any recent stories about clients that are maybe like, hey, should I wait to save up more money, or should I build up my credit, or should I rent for another year and see if the market crashes? Like, what are your like typical conversations you have with people whenever it comes to buying now or waiting?
So I think that as far as conversations that I have with borrowers, I sort of say, or in home buyers, I say the same thing all the time. Like, time in the market is always going to be better than like timing the market. You know what I mean? This is real estate. This is like an asset that in the U.S. It's the most reliable way to sort of like generate wealth and financial stability in terms of investments. It's not crypto. Like,
Right.
I mean, there are charts, and I guess you can stare at that if you want to, but we know historically that a property today is going to be a better value in terms of price than what it's going to be tomorrow.
Yeah.
6 months from now, a year from now.
Right.
And so often what the conversation comes, with me obviously being a lender, rate is a factor. And people will be like, well, rates are kind of high right now. And rates are high compared to what we saw, in 2020, 2021. But that's an aspect of the transaction you can change.
Yeah.
You can't change what you pay for the property. You can't change where the property is located. The financing part, the rate side of it, that is something that you can change. And so, I don't want to be like, hey, ignore the rate, because it is a part of the equation, but do you have the right house?
Right.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're not buying a rate, you're buying a house, whether it's investment or someplace for you to live.
Yeah.
And so people have that conversation. They kind of have that debate. They have people that they know, friends and family, that are doing different things, but nobody's situation is the same.
Yeah. And I think people get confused on what a refinance even is. I feel like, especially for first-time home buyers, they don't even know what date the rate, marry the house means.
Yeah.
Right? So could you explain that a little bit? As
Yeah.
far as, let's say someone buys a $200,000 house today at a 7% interest rate, let's say. How does that work? Like, let's say in 2 years the rate is lower. Like, what's that process?
Yeah, I mean, so rates fluctuate multiple times a day during the course of the day, Monday through Friday. It's tied to the 10-year bond, and so yeah, I mean, you might have a high rate today, but next week, next month, next year, the rate could change and it can be lower. And so when you purchase a house, you lock in a rate, whatever it is. You have your monthly payment. The property, the loan to value, all that stuff's determined, what the value of the property is, that type of stuff. And so you make your payment based on that. And so the rate will continue to fluctuate. And typically, I would say typically not before 6 months of being in that property, if the rates have gone the right direction, and you kind of factor in, because there's title fees and things like that go into a refinance, it may make sense for you to basically redo the loan. And but there's a couple factors. It's not just like lowering the interest rate, right? I mean, if you go from 7 to 6.5%, that's like real savings. You're going to see that. Overall, over 30 years, rarely do people stay in a loan for 30 years. But then also just month to month budget, right? Your payment's going to be less. But the other aspect that you have there in that period of time is that likely that property is appreciated. And so, so when you go to refinance, you could be in a situation where maybe you put 5% down. Okay, so you're at a 95% loan to value. Well, in 6 months' time, a year time, or whatever, maybe that property is appreciated. Now you're at a 90% loan to value. You're at 10%, right? So if you're in that situation, not only does your rate go down, your monthly payment go down, but your mortgage insurance could change. And I've had situations where people, from the time they purchased the home to the time they refinanced, they got into an 80% loan to value situation, and the mortgage insurance goes away completely.
Which could save you what? I mean, depending on the loan price, but
it depends on it.
$100, $200 a month, maybe.
Yeah. Easily. Or you can go from a situation where you're paying $150 a month in mortgage insurance down to a situation where you're paying like $30 or $40 a month in mortgage insurance.
Right.
So the refinance allows you to restructure like the finance terms on the house, right? It doesn't change anything about the sale price of the property. And so, you re-amortize the loan over 30 years. So people say, well, now you're paying, more for it. Okay. Sometimes people strategically refinance into a shorter term. I've got a client that I'm working with right now who's going from 30 years to 15 years.
Yeah.
And so your situation and it's not just tied to rates. your situation when you buy the house could be very different in a year's time or 2 years' time. And so you can use a refinance to, strategically kind of restructure your situation. But really, it's just the mechanism by which you can change that aspect of the deal.
Yeah.
You can't change what you bought for the property, paid for the property. You can't change the location, but you can change the financing situation.
Yeah. We actually did that. We bought our house in like late 2016, and I can't remember what the rate was then, maybe 4.5%, 5%. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, so, we bought it in 2016. I think in 2021 is when we refinanced it, and we were able to refinance at a 2.8 interest rate instead of, let's say, a 4.5 or even a 5%. I can't remember what it was. But so at that point, we had also, paid down our balance on our loan, and our property had also appreciated.
Yeah.
So what we were actually able to do a cash out refinance.
Yep.
So we were able to actually lower our monthly payment on our house and pulled out enough money to redo all of our flooring and all new windows in the house. So we actually further appreciated the value of the house and lowered our monthly payment just because we got into a house that, and again, first-time home buyers, it wasn't our dream home. Right? Yeah, definitely not something to be like super proud of at that moment. But again, time in the market was better than trying to time it and find that perfect house that already had everything done to it that we wanted, right? So we were able to lower that payment and do the stuff that we wanted to do. So really a win-win for us. But again, we were in it for 5 years at that point.
Yeah.
So, it's really having a long-term vision with it versus like, I need the perfect home right now. And if the payment doesn't exactly make sense, then I can't do it.
Yeah.
And I would say that obviously the financials have to make sense, right? Like, you don't want to bank on, I'm going to refinance this thing next year when rates drop. You want to make sure all the finances make sense right now. But in the future, there's a potential possibility that rates could lower, you can refinance this thing, and then you're even more comfortable at that point.
Yeah. And you brought up a good point as far as like pulling, you took some equity out in that situation. And so a refinance, there's basically two types of refinances. There is a cash out refinance, and then there's a rate term. And a rate term is where you basically, the loan as itself, the only thing that changes is the interest rate, and you can change the term where you can keep it on a 30-year, or the cash out version is, you've built equity in it. It's like your equity, and the only way you can really access that other than selling the property is by doing a cash out refinance.
Yeah.
And so so there's a certain amount of money there that you can pull out, and that's a pretty common tool, pretty common tactic for people to do it. And if you get into this perfect storm situation where the rate is that much better at the time, it's sort of a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer. Yeah.
But when it's got to make sense. You got to make sense in your monthly budget, right? That's you can't do something like irresponsible. But I would say that, as people look at like interest rates, because right now that's the big conversation is like, is now a good time to buy? What's going to happen with rates? This and that. That's a variable that you can't control. There are people that are like capped out, right? They can, for them to either qualify or for them to buy the house that they want, they are at the very top of their budget. And interest rate is a factor with that, right? Because it does impact the rate. But, and so that is one part of the market. But the rate, again, it's something that changes, and you can control it. You can control effectively like what your actual rate is, what you're actually paying in terms of finance charges by simply making additional principal payments. Now, I'm not just saying like, oh, you got extra money around, you can throw it around. Most everybody's working off a budget nowadays. But even if it's $50, even if it's $100, even over the course of the year it's $500, anything that you're doing over principal is effectively undercutting that rate, and you're getting a better value than what the actual rate itself is. And so, to use rate as an obstacle to purchase a property, so at times maybe it can be restrictive, but I think you're focusing on the wrong things, and you're costing yourself, again, time in the market is better than time in the market.
For sure.
If you're basing that decision solely on the rate, you're not making the right type of decision.
Yeah. Right before we hopped on, I was like kind of thinking like, okay, if we're waiting to buy, like, do I buy now or do I wait? I was like, okay, what are the variables that someone is paying attention to for that, right? And so I just wrote down a quick little list here. So really the main four is market conditions, right? So what's the market actually doing? Like, how Are property values appreciating? Are they declining? Like, what is the market doing as far as prices go? And then also, what's supply and demand doing? Because we need to look at those two things and say, hey, does it make sense, or is the market on a decline right now? And is there a potential that property values are lower next year than they are this year, right? So that's something we need to look at. Also, what's the mortgage rates doing? Like, based off of any predictions and stuff like that, like, do we see rates coming up, down, or we see them pretty stagnant? Like, what's the market trends with that? But the biggest one is your personal finances, right? Because, like, no matter what is going on out in the world, like, if you don't have enough money to buy a house, it's probably not a good time for you to buy a house. Vice versa, if you got a ton of cash sitting here and you're ready to buy, you're not as affected by these market conditions.
Yeah.
So as far as like budget and stuff goes, do you want to explain to people how, like, what does that mean? I don't think people understand like the whole debt to income thing as far as qualifying and stuff goes. And like when we talk about being house poor and all that type of stuff, like what's that conversation usually sound like?
Yeah, so in order to qualify for a mortgage, so like conventional mortgages, you need to be under 50% debt to income. And what that is that's taking basically your gross income over the course of a month, and it's taking out effectively the expenses that are reporting to a credit bureau. Okay, it doesn't factor in things like, like your cell phone bill, utilities, that type of stuff. It's like, it's money you've borrowed, right? It's credit cards, it's mortgages, student loan payments, car payments, that type of stuff. And so for conventional guidelines, you typically, like the guidelines themselves, you need to be under 50%. Now, somebody's credit situation may require that to be less, based on like the specific situation, but the basic guidelines for conventional is under 50%. FHA under 55%. VA, it can be a little higher. There's some other things that they do, but typically, the idea is you should not be spending like more than 50% of your pre-tax income on expenses. I mean, things that are showing up on like your credit bureau.
Right. So if someone makes, let's say, $5,000 a month before taxes, basically your debt to income is you don't want to exceed $2,500 with house payment, car payment, credit cards, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, and so the way that they factor in the house payment, it's the house, it's the principal and interest payment, it is the property tax, it is the homeowner's insurance. If there's an HOA, the HOA is part of that. It's like all the expenses like associated, with financing that house or having that house. Yeah. And so if you're making $5,000 a month and you have a $500 car payment and that's the only thing that you have, well, then you're going to be capped at $2,000 a month in terms of your monthly payment. And that could be different, based on your insurance, based on your property tax. But that's how that works. It's basically just setting up basically a guardrail there that you can't just spend all your money on the house.
Yeah, and something I was just talking with somebody on the phone about this right before we hopped on, but we were talking about okay, worst case scenario numbers, right? And he's like, okay, so what does that mean as far as worst case scenarios? I'm like, okay, well, the two variables we're looking at for as far as your money goes is what's the purchase price of the property and how much are you putting down? Because really what we care about is the loan amount and then the interest rate, because that affects what that monthly payment looks like as far as your debt to income goes, right? And so, let's say you make $5,000 a month pre-tax, you got a $500 car payment, so you got $2,000 to work with as far as like your principal interest, all that stuff, all in to buy a house. Well, that can be affected by what the amount that you buy a property for, and also the money that you have to put down, right? That affects the loan value. So again, when we come back to personal finances, we're looking at credit, we're looking at income, we're looking at how much money you actually have to put down, because all that stuff can affect if now is a good time for you to buy or not, right? And so it's just so personal. It's very personal with finances as far as is it making sense? Because for me, I mean, again, people probably think we're biased because we're in the industry, but it is important to pay attention to market stats, but at the same time, I think it's way more important just to look at your own personal finances and say, do I have a need to move? Because if you don't really have a need, then we don't need to have a conversation, right? But second, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so, if those two things line up, then it is a good time to buy, no matter really what the market is doing. Yeah. Because on the short term, sure, the market fluctuates, but if we scale this thing back 5, 10, 15 years, things tend to trend upwards. Yeah. And so, I always tell people, hey, let's plan on living in this thing for at least 3 to 5 years so that we can kind of give ourselves a little bit of an equity cushion if something pops up. But other than that, I mean, I feel like it always makes sense to buy if you have a need to buy and the finances make sense.
Yeah, I mean, the need thing is, I sort of feel like your need sort of trumps like the numbers to some extent,
Yeah.
right? You know, you have a situation where you're relocating because of like work, or you know, it seems like a common conversation that I have is you know, there's the life. I'm married. I got a kid now.
Yeah.
You know, I've got stepchildren, that type of stuff, and it changes the story, and it's like a necessity over like quality of
Yeah.
life and the space that you're in.
Yeah, there's a life event that
Yeah.
happens that causes somebody
Yeah,
to move.
yeah. I mean, so my condo, you know, that I bought in 2021. I mean, that was like, I mean, the same time in like 2020, I was not planning on buying a house, right? I mean, I had like some turmoil in my life, and all of a sudden I needed to like buy a house.
Yeah.
And so that was something that was a need situation, you know. Now I did consider renting, but you know, at the same time, you know, you take a look at like, you know, that's just like sunk cost. That's just like money that like you don't have. And I'm not going to be the person that's like, it's never a good idea to rent. Like there are some situations where
There's
would
totally
make sense.
ideas.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
good
totally,
you know, but
I tell people that too. Like, again, the whole let's live we got to live in this house. Honestly, probably 5 years for the numbers really to make sense as far as like the money you're going to put down, the cost if you need to sell this thing, like it costs money to sell a house. So
yeah.
usually you want to stay in the house for at least 5 years
Yeah.
to make those numbers make sense if you need to sell this thing. And so if your job relocates all the time, if you're not ready to settle down in this city, like there's a lot of different factors that go into if it does make sense to buy. So again, if there's the need and
Yeah.
your lifestyle makes sense, then yeah.
But
But
if
if not, then
Yeah, I mean, but financially, like, you know, most of the time, it's going to if you can do it, it makes sense to purchase.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I have my like facts here on my sheet here, but it says here the median homeowner's net worth is 40 times higher than a renter's, right?
For sure.
It makes sense because, you know, yeah, I mean, you're making that payment, but that payment is going towards some sort of equity. It's going
Yeah.
towards, it allows you to have an asset that, like, you may not fully own that asset, but you got the equity
it's
there.
a forced savings account, basically.
Yeah, that's actually, I think I actually have that written down
Yeah,
here.
it's
that
literally a forced savings
yeah.
account is all it really
Yeah.
is. So
And so, I mean, I think that I'm 50. I can remember, you know, 2008, 2009, like the big like financial crisis. You know, there was a period of time there where you had in parts of the country, lots of parts of the country, you had like property values retracing. You know, and there was a lot of like kind of like hairy, like, you know, I mean, that was a lot of that had to do with like some really bad like lending practices that just simply aren't there anymore. And so, but even in that period, I mean, it was a short window where you had that depreciation, but people that held on to their houses overall, I mean, they're still ahead.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we're not making any more land.
yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Limited resources here.
yeah, and so real estate, you know, in the United States, it's just like it's a finite thing. And so, you know, you buy a piece of property, you know, it just makes sense that should appreciate. Now you got to do some things as well. I mean, you got to maintain it.
Right.
You know, there's some responsibilities that you have to protect your asset as well.
Yeah.
But it just, you know, regardless of what's going on with the rates, property values, you know, tend to increase. Now, the other thing that you do find though is as rates decrease, property values go up. It's sort of like whatever the real estate god is going to get, you know what I mean? Like,
Well,
his or hers regardless.
Yeah, I always explain this to people too, because again, we're dealing with a limited resource, right? We can't
Yeah.
just like, there's not new houses that we can just like pop them up like that,
Right.
right? So there's only a certain number of houses for sale. Of course, builders are trying to develop more properties and stuff, but those take, 7, 9, 12 months plus sometimes. And so, everybody's like, okay, and I was going to get into the whole devil's advocate thing here in a second about the market crashing, but let's talk about the whole supply and demand thing, right? So, rates 6.5%, 7%, average right now, whatever. We only have so many, let's see, we have a 2-month supply inventory right now. We have 2,000, let's say 2,100 pending sales, right?
Okay.
So we had, let's say 2,100 houses for sale, last month or whatever, right? Well, let's say that rate drops from 7 to now 5% or something like that, right? Well, what's that going to do? obviously it's going to flood the market because money just got cheaper to borrow. And so now you're going to create this higher demand of buyers that want to now enter the market because it's now more accessible to do that.
Yeah.
But the issue is we only have so many houses for sale.
Right.
So now if we have 2,000 units for sale, and let's say, just random number, we had 500 buyers, or let's say 1,000 buyers or whatever. Well, now with the rate lower, now more of those buyers are going to flood into the market, but we still only have a certain amount of. So now we got more people fighting for the same number of houses, and obviously that's going to drive the bidding wars and all that stuff up.
And you've got to so you mentioned you refinanced around like 2021, something like that. Okay, right. So one of the effects of COVID, rates just dropped, and so to ridiculously low levels, like unhealthy levels.
Yeah.
Unheard of. I mean, it was great to get in on that, and I was able to be a part of that, like when I purchased my condo. But those are exceptionally low rates, and you have people that would have moved since then, whether because they just wanted a new house or a bigger house. I mean, we're Americans, we consume.
Right.
Like every few years we're going to want something something bigger and better. And so, but the difference in the rates, rates like in kind of in the 6s and 7s, people are looking at the 2%, 2.5% that they have right now, and they're just like, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And so those people have sat in homes and properties longer than what they normally would have.
Yeah.
And so, you've reached a point now where people, they don't necessarily have the luxury to wait anymore because of like their family situation or whatever. Like they need a bigger house.
That's us, right?
Yeah, and so you've got the fact that it's been 5 years since COVID. That lock-in effect is not as powerful, because people that have been watching rates the last like year and a half, they've not changed a lot. Yeah. Like you talk about like the experts in our industry, at the beginning of the year, they put out, it's like Fannie Mae, Wells Fargo, a handful, and they're always like, we expect rates to be X by the end of the year. And for as long as I've been in this business, what they project at the beginning of the year, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, it's just,
so to some extent, you have to just kind of like let that go and then be like, what makes sense for us. But right now, that lock-in effect of those people that were in the twos, that's going away. Yeah. So you have people that are just naturally coming into the market because they've reached a point in their life where they want to buy houses. But now you also have these people that have been like waiting to buy a house, and they're just like, we got to do it.
Yeah.
And so so you got more people, rates start to drop. It just becomes a much more competitive market.
For sure. And there's a whole rate lock thing too of like, okay, like, I don't want to move because of rate. I'm in a 2.5 rate and it just doesn't make sense for me to go do this. Yeah. So we're rate locked. Like I think it's like 65% of homeowners have a interest rate under 3%.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense to move. But, again, devil's advocate on, my example of it going from 7 to 5, that helps the whole rate lock situation, right? So there's going to be more total activity in the market, but there's still this inventory issue where we're just not really, like the inventory level is just not where we need it to be to see a market crash.
Well, as people like get out of that situation where they're kind of locked in, that's going to help contribute in terms of inventory.
For sure.
But it's just, we've known for as long as there's been YouTube, there have been videos saying, hey, the fastest way to like grow wealth in the U.S. is this, right? Yeah. We all understand this, right? And it's one of those things that's just kind of proven time and time again. And so I would say that if you're like right now, with rates where they are, I actually think that's an advantage to a home buyer.
100%.
Because it's just going to be chaos. It's going to be great. We're going to be able to take advantage of it. We're in the right business for when it does break loose. But it's going to be a very stressful situation as rates come down and people at the same time enter the market.
Yeah, yeah. I try to explain that to people too, because again, it all comes back to personal finances. If it makes sense, it makes sense. But there actually is an advantage for a buyer to enter the market while rates are high, because everybody else is sitting on the sidelines waiting for them to lower. So that way, if you get in while rates are at 7, while everybody else is sitting on the sidelines, you have less competition. Yep. I mean, dude, I've seen so many houses have price drops recently. Houses sit on the market for longer than they usually do. Again, part of that is winter and just seasonality. But again, if those rates were to drop, like a drastic drop, so many more people flood the market, and it just creates more of that competition. So, it's the whole like Warren Buffett thing where it's like, buy when the markets are down, right?
Yeah.
That's really, because
Yeah.
like, again, you can almost look at the housing market just like any other market, like the stock market, right? Like it ebbs and flows, goes up and down, and really the money is made when when times aren't great, right?
I have, I can't remember the specific like numbers, but there was a percentage of it. But I was listening to an audiobook, and it was talking about the number of like Fortune 500 or Dow companies that originated
In the
in the
recession.
depression.
Yeah.
Well, in the,
Oh, in the
depression
depression.
before.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, those are sure those are challenging times, overall for people, but those are also areas of opportunity as well.
For sure, for sure. I want to go over market stats just to kind of like, again, kind of play devil's advocate of like, okay, let's say you're looking at, again, let's talk about a first-time home buyer, let's say a 250 house, 200 house. Like what is appreciation doing? What is inventory doing? All that type of stuff. That way, people just have a better idea of like what is the landscape that they're getting into,
Yeah.
right? And then also just for current homeowners, I have people ask me all the time, how's the market, this and that. And so
Yeah.
I feel like it's good just to inform people of what the market is actually doing,
Yeah.
right? So here's our market stats, people.
Oh, good. I was glad you had the stats.
Yeah, I got the stats right here. So, I mean, first of all, we got to talk about home average sales price, right? Because I hear this all the time. Oh, I'm not going to buy right now. Prices are crazy. I'm going to wait for the market to crash, right? So, again, we're looking at supply and demand with that.
Do
But
you know how insane that sounds?
I know.
Just I'm waiting for the market crash. I sometimes feel like and I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I just say something dumb because I don't have anything else to say. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just like say this thing and but it's funny because I've heard people use that word like
All the
there's
time.
the housing crash, and I'm like,
all the
get
time.
in on that.
Yeah, all the time.
Anyway, sorry.
And so usually when someone tells me that, like, oh, I'm waiting for the housing market to crash, I usually am like, okay, what makes you think the market's going to crash, right? And they're like, oh, like, because you look back to, let's say, 2008 when that crashed, right? We had all that lending stuff and a ton of foreclosures flooded the market, right? So basically, foreclosures flooded the market, and now we have way more inventory than we do demand, right? So we have low demand, we have super high inventory levels. Well, now as a buyer in 2008, I have my pick of the litter, right? Versus right now, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
Right. As a buyer, I got like two options to pick from, and there's also like 10 buyers on my tail too that I got to fight with. Right. So anytime we're looking at market stats, we're looking at year over year. So January of 25 versus January of 24 for January's market stats. But prices are actually up 10% from last year. So if we're talking about a market crash, right, like we know demand is a little bit lower right now because of the affordability issue. With the rates being a little bit higher, prices also continuing to rise. But when people ask me, are home prices crashing? No, it's the exact opposite.
Right.
Like a 10% appreciation is actually nuts.
Right.
Right. From a market standpoint, that's crazy. But to be fair, inventory is still right where it's been. Like there's no growth or decline in inventory. So we're still at 2 months of supply for inventory. And just so everybody knows, anything below like a 6-month inventory is technically a seller's market.
Yeah.
So like we have quite a ways to go to even get into kind of this balanced market.
Is this like
This is just the greater, this is January 2025 greater Kansas City area. So, and that markets are hyper local, right? Like we can look at just Clay County or just Platte County or just, Johnson County or whatever. This is like kind of a whole like KC metro area. And these stats will change depending on like specific locations, but as a whole for like the greater Kansas City area, this is kind of what we're looking at is prices are still climbing. It is taking longer for homes to sell. So days on market average is 49.
Right, but you got the fact that we had 2 winter storms, or what I mean.
Yeah,
January
exactly.
is rough. The seasonality plays a role.
Yeah,
in
so
that.
it'd be interesting to follow these numbers as we get into the spring market, especially because like we're always comparing month to month, right? So we're talking January of 24 versus January 25. And part of the reason for days on market is I feel the market's not quite as strong as it was back in 2022, 2023, right? Because that's where we really started to see rates kind of start to climb up. And so it's taking longer for homes to sell right now. And we're actually seeing more price decreases because sellers are still in a mindset of 2021 where we throw a sign in the yard and a day later we have 10 offers over asking price.
Well, it's interesting that you say you talk about seeing price reductions. I don't, from my opinion, when I see price reductions in Kansas City in this market, I don't think that's not indicative of the values of the properties. To me,
No.
more often than not, that's either not under whoever's pricing that property, and it's not. I mean, it's not always the realtor that's.
No, it's usually
you
the
know what I
seller.
mean? Yeah, I mean,
it's usually
and
the
so-
seller wanting to get some ridiculous price for the house,
Yeah.
and the agent saying, "Hey, we can try it at that price." Sometimes the agent's like, "Whatever," you know what I mean? But like, usually, like I've had situations where a seller wants more money than what the data is saying we should list it for.
Yeah.
And usually, for me, that conversation is, "Hey, I understand that. It's going to put us at a disadvantage because of our, as days on market creeps up, then we have, less offer. There's a correlation between time on market and offer
Yeah.
strength." And so I set that up for, hey, we can list this thing high, but it's not going to be a very smooth experience versus if there's a strategy to pricing it accordingly, right? But, again, sellers are still in the mindset of 2021 where they can just put some ridiculous price on this thing and people are just going to be, knocking the door down trying to get through it. And that is the case on some houses. But you have to have, we call them A+ properties, right? Like you got to be bringing a really good product to the market. And position it in a place with a price to drive that bidding war, right? But if you're not bringing an A+ property to the market and you're pricing this thing at top dollar or even higher than top dollar from what the data suggests, I mean, it's going to sit. And we're seeing that more often. We're seeing houses that are overpriced because the seller wants to try to milk as much money as they can out of it, and then you got to drop it accordingly. So that's why we're seeing days on market sit a little higher.
One of the things that I've seen, and this is more of a pricing conversation, but something that I've seen here recently in transactions that I've been involved in is intentionally underpricing properties.
Yeah, I was just talking yesterday at a
strategy.
listing appointment about that.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's a couple agents I've worked with, they're like, hey, this is the house we're going to make the offer on. And you look at it and you're like, man, that's like. This is a multiple offer situation because anybody looking at that, right?
Yeah.
Say it's a house that should go for like $275 well, that's kind of extreme, but $250, right? They get it, they price it in a bucket that's going to draw more eyes, but people see value and all of a sudden it's a bidding war.
So I was on a listing appointment yesterday and I pulled 2 comps in their neighborhood where I showed this, right? Because they're kind of in like a time crunch situation where they're going to be contingent, on their next house and stuff. And hey, we need a fast sale. Yeah. So there's 2 comps in their neighborhood where one was listed at 200, it sold for 254, 2 days on market, and another one they listed at 225 and it sold for 250. Right, and so there's a strategy, especially if time is a factor and you need your house to go under contract so you can buy your next house. There's totally a strategy to doing that. New houses are kind of on the radar for me and Kelsey right now. Yeah. And Kelsey sent me a house the other day. Because we've been kind of keeping our eye on stuff right over here in I think it was in Carriage Hills, or Brooktree or something like that. They listed this thing at $315, and like I'm scrolling through the pictures and I was like, this is a $350 plus house, like all day. Like I would buy this thing for $350, like in a heartbeat. Yeah. And so she's like, maybe we should go look at it, blah blah. And I looked at the showing instructions. The house had literally just hit the market, and they had an offer deadline for 5 o'clock that day, right? And so who knows what it went? Who knows what the offer is on it? But like. Totally, whole different conversation. But like from a seller strategy standpoint, like there's definitely a pricing strategy to get that bid war effect going on. But again, you got to have the seller on board with that. A lot of sellers are like, no way, I need, again, that 315 house that probably went for 350 plus. Some sellers are, no, this is a 425 house all day. You know what I mean? And you're like, all right, dude, but it's not going to be good. It's not going to be pretty when we're sitting on the market for a long time and we get some low ball offer and they just nickel and dime us to all heck. So overall, month supply is down. Or sorry, it's the same. But overall market activity is down down just a little bit. We're down. Pending sales down 5.7%. Again, some of that might be winter storm stuff or winter seasonality. Some of it can be this whole affordability issue that we have going on right now with prices still continuing to climb because there's still demand. And so,
from my perspective, it's heating up.
Oh yeah,
and so it's a different because I look at applications
for sure.
You know what I mean? And these are people that are like early in the process starting to consider it, and really February. I mean, it's
I won't be surprised if as we get into a spring market, these pending sales flip-flop, and now we
Yeah.
actually have more pending sales than we did. But as far as last January, we're down 5.7%.
Yeah, I really feel like a lot of that is a season. A function
Yeah, I mean,
of
we're
the
talking about
seasonality.
January. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, like there's a ton of snow on the ground, all that type of stuff. So yeah, as we get into March, April, May, like these numbers are all going to change when we're comparing, you know, last May to this May and all this type of stuff. But yeah, something else that was interesting to me with the whole price drop thing that we were talking about is list to sold price ratio is at 96.1%. So basically what that means is like let's say people are listing at easy math 100K,
Yeah.
right? They're getting 96, right?
Right.
Because sellers are still in the mindset of pricing aggressively, and buyers are smart. Buyers know the market because they're in and out of these houses, you know, trying to lock the right one down. And so buyers are smart about like looking at a house and saying, this one feels a little overpriced, or this one's a great value, or
Yeah.
you know, this one's pretty steady. And so we're seeing with sellers, you know, because sellers are, is it a good time to sell? You know, like, you know, how's the market? You know,
Yeah.
and so it's good, right? Like prices are appreciating, like your asset is not losing value. We just have to be smart about pricing it so that we're in the driver's seat from a selling standpoint, that we're not the one getting nickeled and dimed, and that we, you know, we have the product. We want to be the strong negotiator here. And again, this is more pricing strategy stuff, but you overprice, then you sit on the market. Now you got to deal with whatever rolls in versus pricing it accordingly.
Yeah.
And you having your pick of the litter with offers, you know, versus starting too high, and then you got to wait and just see what rolls in. So
I don't know if you have a metric that you look at on your end of the deal, but to me, days on the market would be like a really like pivotal important number for me to look at. And even, you know, when I was in the car business, that was like, you know, how long we've had that particular car, whatever. I mean, that was like a big deal. We were hyper focused on it.
For sure. It's huge.
And yeah, so I would assume that.
Yeah, days on market is a massive part of the whole like listing presentation. It's a huge part of setting expectations. So usually what I do is I'll look at average days on market to get a contract like for their specific, because again, this is very general. Like 49 days sounds like a long time. Right.
But 30 days to close is pretty average. It's not.
Well, that's to get a contract.
Yeah.
That's just a contract.
I gotcha.
So like we sign and it goes in the yard, and then we go pending.
Gotcha.
So, but again, that's the whole market as a whole. That's all the ones that sell first day on market, and then also the ones that expire, right? So it's a general number. But if you look like on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, you usually get a pretty good idea, right? So the listing appointment I went on yesterday, average days on market was 18 days for that specific type of house in that area, right? And so you're looking at it, and I have this whole chart that's like shows correlation between like offer strength and days on market. So it's kind of this chart where you start high and it goes down like that, right? So it's like first day on market, you know, potentially 110% plus off, you know, list to sold price. And so that's what we're looking at. We're setting expectations. Hey, if we don't have a contract by 18 days, we are now below average. Like we did not position ourselves correctly to be the obvious choice for buyers in this market, right? So that's where the whole pricing strategy comes in is, and I always tell people, I tell sellers too, like what we list it for isn't what we sell it for, right? Because like you said earlier, it's a strategy to actually list just slightly below market value to create this perception of value to then drive the bidding war, right? And so from a buyer, when I'm working with buyers, that sucks to do that on the buy side.
Right.
But on the sell side, it's a total strategy to get your seller the best offer.
Yeah.
So. Yeah,
I think I feel like our days on market in terms of it's all about a function of price and like your strategy going to market. And on the other side of it, as far as a buyer goes, it's now a good time to buy. I mean, that if you take the time and you go through like the market, what's available, you can find value in any market, right? Yeah. And so, and so you've got a property that's been sitting there for 40 days, right? Well, you might have the buyer who that's the perfect property for, right? The thing that is the issue for other people. And so, when somebody's like, it's now a good time to buy, it's like,
there's opportunity everywhere.
There's always opportunity. I mean, that's just it. Like at no point, and this is like as bad as things got like in 2023 and 2024 in this business, at no point was no houses sold, right? I mean, it just always...
We had over 4 million units sold in 2024.
Yeah, and so I think that for somebody who is looking to purchase a home or their first home, or they're like they're not in a situation where their lease is over in 3 weeks, right? But it is something they're looking to do. I think you can find value regardless of what the rates are, regardless of what the overall property values are in an area. If you just match up with the right person and you're very specific, you have a plan.
Yeah,
I think you can find value in any of those situations.
For sure. Just to wrap it up, sometimes I hear people, let's say, again, first-time home buyer, maybe finances just like aren't the greatest. And people are like, okay, well, what if, like, let's say right now I have $5,000 saved up to buy a house. Sometimes people come to me and say, hey, should I save more money before I put down? And like, what are your thoughts on like saving more money, working on your credit, all that type of stuff? And when we're talking about like, should I do something now or should I wait?
I think that the most important thing you can do in a situation like that is get a professional involved. And so in this situation, me or the lender would be the professional that you'd want to talk to. And so until you actually go through the process of completing the application, having your credit reviewed, having your income like calculated in the way that like underwriters calculate income, it's really difficult to know what you even qualify for. So how would you be able to know if it's a good time to do it or not? Mm-hmm. And so, I've had situations where, having $5,000 more money in the bank might make somebody feel better about a situation, but it has zero impact on what's going to happen with the transaction.
Right.
And, potentially, just knowing that like the best time to buy a house was yesterday, and the second best time is today, just knowing that it's going to appreciate, there's a good chance it could cost you money, but you don't know. You just don't know until you actually go through the activity.
Yeah.
And I think that, like for me, and I did a reel about this recently, I always do a soft pull because there's no penalties. It doesn't impact the person, but it gives me like the debts and the close enough that I can see, hey, this is what the setup looks like. But then, there have been some situations where somebody hasn't been able to buy a house because they were $5,000 short. So, it can have an impact on you, but you just don't know until you go through those activities and see what the process looks like.
Yeah. And something I always say too is if you're thinking about doing something 6 months from now or a year from now, now's the best time to reach out.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of things that people, I think about this stuff on a daily basis because I've been around credit for 20 years in some sort of different way, whether it was in the car business or it's mortgages. But, what you make, hourly salary or whatever, commission or whatever, an underwriter could calculate that differently than like how you calculate it, right? Things like, job time, type of business, there's all these like different factors that go into determining if you actually qualify that, yes, you can dig through and you can figure out all that stuff like on your own, but most people aren't like pulling their credit. Most people aren't like sitting there with like the worksheets that underwriters use to calculate their income.
Right.
And so it's just one of those things. Just if you're thinking about doing it in 6 months, figure it out now so you know what you're at least planning for.
For sure. I always say that because like, you want to get a game plan. And like this is buying a home or selling a home is already like such a stressful process that like not planning for it makes it even more stressful.
Yeah.
And so I feel like sometimes people are worried to reach out too early because for one, there's the whole salesman thing. It's like, oh, are they going to pressure me to do something? And like, definitely not, right? Like it hurts my business if I try to pressure somebody into something and then they're not happy with how the thing turned out, right?
Like this is a house.
Yeah, like you're stuck with this thing, right?
I don't feel like you're going to smooth talk anybody into spending $150,000, right? I mean, it's just information.
Yeah, and so I feel like the best thing people can do is reach out, start the conversation. Like there is no pressure involved. It's like, does it make sense for you now or not? And if not, like that's totally fine too. At least now you know, or you have a game plan of, hey, it doesn't make sense right now because of X, Y, or Z, and now you have a game plan of what you need to work on so that it does make sense maybe next year or whatever that timeline looks like.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, can I say a couple things since
I
have you? Okay, so if you weren't born, but if you were given the opportunity today to go back to 1980 and buy real estate, would you try to figure out a way to do it?
For sure.
Yeah.
From the sparkle in my daddy's eye, I would have been throwing my down payment
and
out.
so do you know what the rates were in 1981?
They were like high
18%.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, but knowing what you know today, would you be like, I'll figure that out? Now, granted, property values are much less, but like, you know what I mean? Like that if I try to give like 18% is like a really, really bad
It's like a
rate,
credit
bad
card.
credit.
Yeah,
Like,
that's like a
yeah, but
credit
that's
card
like, you know,
thing.
you shouldn't even be buying a car.
Yeah.
You know, and so, I mean, I think that's sort of like, I have conversations with my owner all the time when he talks about like rates are historically low. If you're in the market right now, it doesn't matter that rates were 18% in 1980. You're just dealing with it, right? And then you're dealing with like friends and family who bought houses 4 years ago and they're bragging about their 2 and 3% rate. Yeah. But it's just the difference of the situation. Yeah. You know, and so just kind of like my whole point with like the interest rate, it's a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure.
But you have a house, right? And you know that houses historically are going to appreciate. And the reality is, if you get into situations where they're not, there are bigger problems in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like we're probably dealing with a war or like some kind
I mean,
of like the world's falling apart.
Yeah, a big like catastrophic type of a thing.
Yeah.
But I still look at, you know, homes, you can build wealth, you can generate income, you can use it as an investment tool. But for me, it's like where I get to live.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
the whole
know,
thing. Mm-hmm.
I mean, my property taxes fluctuate a little bit, but I don't have to deal with the landlord like raising my rent next month or next year when it's time to renew. I know what I'm dealing with.
That I'm glad you brought. One last thing, property taxes and insurance. So during this conversation that kicked this whole like topic off, and I've seen multiple people say this is, oh, you know, even owning a house now, my mortgage, you know, my payment's going up every single year because of insurance and property taxes. Yes, that's true. Right? Like taxes are going up. Insurance is nuts right now.
Yeah.
But I just had my escrow analysis like redone. My payment went up $5.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So somebody had made a statement about like their payment going up $100 per year or something. I'm like, that sounds a little ridiculous to me. I mean, maybe it's true, but overall, you have a pretty steady payment with your mortgage, right? Like it's going to fluctuate a little bit if your escrow account is short and they need to now pull more money out because either taxes or insurance went up. It's not raising at the rate your rent is going to, unless you just have some like great landlord that has you locked in at some rate.
You can have some situations with property tax, and a lot of people in Jackson County the last couple of years have gone through this where they feel like the property taxes have been like suppressed, like, you know, and now they have to make the adjustments. And so you can't, it can be a number, right? You know, whether it's property tax or homeowners insurance. But I mean, we have all sorts of things over the course of our daily life that we're paying more for today than we did yesterday, and we don't even like stop to think about it, right? And so, but you know, there are also mechanisms where you can kind of protest that type of stuff, you know, with the assessor. But yeah, no, I think that. And I deal with people with this like all the time because they kind of get to the end of the lease, you know, and maybe they should have had this conversation with me 6 months prior, right? Because now they're like, oh, my lease ends in 45 days. I got to kind of figure this out. But I know what I'm paying, you know. I just don't have, and I'm not going to have a situation where somebody's like, hey, FYI, I sold this place. Now you got to move out entirely.
Exactly.
And that stability for me, that's important to me, and that's what you get when you own a home.
100%. Cool. All right, baby. I think that's the episode.
Yeah, I think so too.